I remember the day I first stood before the Basilica of Eternal Vigil, though I wonder now if what I remember is truly mine or merely an echo of the person I once was. The structure rose from the hive's mid-levels like a great iron fist thrust toward the smog-choked sky, its buttresses blackened by centuries of industrial exhaust and the prayers of billions. I was 23 standard years old, freshly graduated from the Schola Progenium with commendations for marksmanship and an unblemished record of devotion. My Lazaraful was blessed, my flak armor polished to a dull sheen, and the aquila hanging from my neck still gleamed with the naive hope of youth. The air that morning tasted of recycled oxygen mixed with the ever-present tang of promethium fumes, and I could hear the distant grinding of manufactorum machinery that never, ever stopped, not for sleep, not for prayer, not for death. I thought I understood duty then. I thought I understood sacrifice. The Emperor forgive my ignorance. The chapel guard was considered an honor posting, one that many of my fellow graduates had coveted with an intensity that bordered on desperation. To protect the sacred spaces where the faithful came to prostrate themselves before the God Emperor's glory, to stand watch over the relics and the priests who tended them, this was service of the highest order, or so we were told. The selection process had been rigorous, involving not only tests of martial prowess, but lengthy theological examinations administered by dour ecclesiarchy officials who seemed to peer into one's very soul. I had answered every catechism correctly, quoted the appropriate passages from the Lectitio Divinitatis, and demonstrated the required zealotry when denouncing heresy in all its forms. When the seal of approval came through on my data slate, embossed with the three-headed eagle of the Ministorum, I had wept with joy. My dormitory companions had embraced me, their congratulations echoing in the cold stone chamber we shared. None of them had been chosen. I see their faces sometimes in my dreams, young and full of faith, and I wonder if they were the fortunate ones. My first posting was to the western entrance, a massive archway carved with scenes of the Emperor's ascension, each figure rendered in such detail that you could see the agony and ecstasy in their frozen faces. The doors themselves were 3 meters of blessed bronze, inscribed with 10,000 names of martyrs, and they moved on hinges that groaned like dying men. I stood there for 12-hour shifts, 6 days in 7, my boots planted on marble worn smooth by millennia of pilgrims' feet. The 7th day was for maintenance, cleaning my weapon, polishing my armor, attending the mandatory prayer services that stretched for hours in chapels so thick with incense smoke that breathing became a conscious effort. The other guards were quiet men and women, most of them older than me by a decade or more, their faces bearing the weathered look of those who had stood watch for years. They spoke little during our brief overlaps at shift change, offering only curt nods and the occasional murmured blessing. I learned quickly that silence was the unwritten rule of our order. Words were for prayers, not for fellowship. The pilgrims came in endless streams, their numbers swelling and ebbing with the hive's work cycles but never truly ceasing. Workers from the lower levels stumbled up the thousands of steps, their bodies bent from lifetimes of labor, their lungs rasping with pneumoconiosis from decades of breathing recycled air thick with industrial particulate. They carried offerings, small things, mostly, because few in the hive had much to give. Scrawled prayers on scraps of parchment, bent coins pressed from metals whose names they likely didn't know, tiny effigies carved from scrap plastic during stolen moments in the manufactorums. These they would place at the feet of the great statues that lined the basilica's nave, genuine devotion shining in eyes dimmed by exhaustion and malnutrition. I watched them pray, their lips moving in whispered litanies, and I felt my own faith strengthen. These people had so little, yet they gave what they could to honor him. How could I do less? Sometimes nobility came, their arrival announced by the whine of grav vehicles and the sharp commands of their private guards. They moved through the basilica like a different species entirely, wrapped in climate-controlled robes, their skin unmarked by labor or hardship, their augmentics gleaming with expensive metals rather than crude industrial replacements. They brought offerings too, but theirs were calculated displays, gilded reliquaries, jeweled icons, donation chits with sums that could have fed a hab-block for a year. They prayed in the private chapels, behind curtains of Terran silk, while servitors burned rare incenses that made the air thick and sweet. I was instructed to bow my head when they passed, to show deference to those blessed by the Emperor with wealth and station. I did so, though something in my chest tightened each time. The God Emperor, we were taught, saw no difference between rich and poor. All were his servants. All were equally insignificant before his majesty. Yet here, in his house, the divisions seemed carved in stone as surely as the reliefs on the walls. The priests moved through the basilica like black-robed shadows, their faces hidden beneath deep cowls, their hands bearing the scars of ritual flagellation. They tended the candles, there were thousands of them, each one representing a prayer or a soul offered to the Emperor's service, and they led the services that punctuated each day. The liturgies were beautiful in their way, full of archaic high Gothic phrases that rolled off the tongue like ancient poetry. But they lasted hours, and standing at attention throughout them made my legs cramp and my back ache. The lead priest, a man whose name I never learned, had a voice like grinding stone, and he preached with a fury that bordered on violence, his words echoing through the vaulted spaces until they became a physical force. He spoke of duty and sacrifice, of the countless billions who served the Imperium in ways great and small, of the eternal war against chaos and Xenos and heretic. He spoke of death as the ultimate service, the final offering that all must eventually make. I believed every word. My fellow guards and I existed in a strange liminal space between the pilgrims and the priests, neither fully part of the congregation nor truly separate from it. We were watchers, observers of devotion rather than participants, though we mouthed the prayers along with everyone else during services. Our duty was to maintain security, to watch for threats both obvious and subtle. We had been trained to spot the signs, nervous gestures, inappropriate interest in the basilica's layout, the telltale bulge of concealed weapons, the glassy-eyed stare of the mind scrubbed. We were taught that heresy could hide in any heart, that corruption might wear the face of the devout. Vigilance was our highest virtue, suspicion our constant companion. I learned to watch the crowds with an intensity that made my eyes burn, cataloguing faces, noting behaviors, always alert for anything out of place. It was exhausting in a way that physical labor never was, this constant state of paranoid awareness, but I threw myself into it with the fervor of the newly initiated. 3 months into my posting, I made my first arrest. A young man, perhaps 16 standard, had been acting strangely during evening vespers, his lips moving in words that didn't match the liturgy. I had watched him for 10 minutes, my hand slowly moving to the shock maul at my belt, before I was certain. When I approached, he bolted, confirming his guilt. The chase was brief. He was malnourished and weak, his body bearing the telltale signs of underhive origins, and I brought him down with a shock baton strike to the base of the spine. He lay twitching on the marble while I called for the Arbites, and when they arrived, they dragged him away without questions. I never learned what happened to him, what words he had been speaking, what thoughts had led him to whatever heresy he had embraced. The senior guard who witnessed the arrest clapped me on the shoulder, the first real human contact I'd had in months, and muttered a brief, "Well done." I felt pride swell in my chest, warm and bright. I had protected the Emperor's house. I had done my duty. After that first arrest, I became more zealous in my vigilance, more aggressive in my suspicions. I stopped 3 more people in the following weeks. Though only one resulted in an arrest, the others were simply confused, their prayers out of sequence or their devotions expressed in ways unfamiliar to me. The one genuine heretic, a woman who had been carrying pamphlets hidden in her robes, screamed when the Arbites took her, her voice rising in shrieking denial until a shock prod silenced her. I told myself her suffering was necessary, that she had brought it upon herself by turning from the Emperor's light. I told myself that mercy toward the heretic was cruelty toward the faithful. I repeated these lessons like catechisms, using them to silence the small voice in my head that whispered questions I didn't want to hear. The other guards began to nod to me with what might have been respect, The priests acknowledged my presence with brief blessings. I was becoming what I was meant to be: a guardian, a protector, a weapon in the Emperor's hand. The basilica began to reveal itself to me in layers as the months passed. During my shifts, when the crowds thinned in the small hours before dawn or in the dead hours of afternoon, I would study the architecture, letting my eyes trace the lines of columns that rose 30 meters to a ceiling painted with scenes of the Emperor's great victories. The frescoes were ancient, their colors faded and flaking, but still magnificent here. The Emperor leading his armies against the Xenos. There, the Emperor bringing light to worlds shrouded in darkness. Everywhere, the Emperor triumphant, golden, eternal. I memorized every figure, every symbol, every inscription carved into the stone. The basilica became my world, its geography as familiar to me as my own body. I knew which flagstones were cracked, which alcoves gathered the most shadows, which acoustical properties made certain spots perfect for eavesdropping on whispered conversations. I knew where the pilgrims prayed most fervently, and where they merely went through the motions. I knew the basilica's sounds: the specific creak of the northern side entrance, the echo of footsteps in the eastern transept, the hollow boom when someone struck the brass gong that announced high services. I became part of the structure itself, as fixed and unchanging as the stone. But the basilica had secrets too, places that the pilgrims never saw, and most guards never entered. There were maintenance corridors behind the walls, narrow passages where servitors shuffled in endless loops, tending to systems whose purposes I could only guess. There were storage crypts beneath the main floor, accessed through locked hatches that bore the seals of the Adeptus Mechanicus, and sometimes I would hear sounds rising from below: mechanical grinding, metallic clanging, and once, a sound that might have been screaming or might have been merely damaged machinery. We were instructed never to investigate these sounds, never to venture into areas not explicitly assigned to us. The basilica, we were told, was maintained by others whose sacred duties were their own. Questions were discouraged. Obedience was expected. I learned not to look too closely at the servitors that passed me in the corridors, not to wonder about the human features that sometimes seemed to move with expressions that suggested something more than mere mechanical response. I learned not to think about the locked doors or the sounds that came from behind them. I learned to narrow my focus to my immediate duty, to see only what I was meant to see. The winters in the hive were not like the winters I had read about in training texts describing feral worlds or agri-worlds where seasons actually changed. Here, winter meant the heating systems ran less frequently to conserve power, which meant the basilica's great interior became cold enough to see one's breath, cold enough that the pilgrims shivered, despite their layers of poor fabric, and we guards stood watch, with fingers gone numb inside our gloves. The cold made the stone seem even harder, the architecture even less forgiving. Ice formed on the inside of the high windows, creating patterns that the priests said were signs of the Emperor's favor, though they looked like ordinary crystallization to me. The cold made my joints ache during the long shifts, made my thoughts slow and sluggish, made the hours stretch even longer than usual. But we endured, because endurance was the test of faith, and faith was everything. It was during one of those cold months that I first noticed the changes in myself. Small things, at first a tremor in my hands that wouldn't stop, a tightness in my chest that had nothing to do with the incense smoke, a tendency to startle at sudden sounds that I had previously filtered out. I began having trouble sleeping during my off hours, lying in my narrow bunk in the guard's dormitory while the minutes crawled past and my mind refused to quiet. When I did sleep, I dreamed of the basilica, its corridors stretching endlessly, its shadows moving with purposeful malevolence, its statues turning their heads to watch me with eyes that wept blood. I would wake, gasping, my body drenched in sweat despite the cold, and I would lie there until the alarm chimed to signal the beginning of another shift. I told myself it was merely exhaustion, that the long hours and constant vigilance were taking a natural toll. I told myself that everyone struggled with such things, that it was weakness to complain. I said nothing to anyone. My vigilance, instead of waning, intensified to the point of obsession. I began to see threats everywhere, in the way a pilgrim held his hands, in the pattern of foot traffic through the nave, in the timing of the services themselves. I started keeping notes in a small journal I had acquired from the administratum quarter, recording observations, sketching diagrams of suspicious behavior patterns, constructing elaborate theories about potential heresies lurking beneath the surface of apparent devotion. The other guards began to avoid me during shift changes, their brief nods becoming even more curt, their eyes sliding away from mine when I tried to engage them in discussion of my findings. I interpreted their distance as jealousy or complacency, never as concern. I was the faithful one, I told myself. I was the one who truly understood the weight of our responsibility. Then came the day I killed a man. Not arrested, not subdued, killed. He had been standing in front of a minor shrine, his lips moving in prayer, when something about his posture triggered every alarm I had trained myself to recognize. I approached from behind, my hand on my shock maul, and when I demanded he identify himself, he turned too quickly, his hand moving toward his robes. I saw a weapon, I was certain I saw a weapon, and I struck without hesitation, the powered maul connecting with his temple with a crack that echoed through the basilica like a thunderclap. He dropped instantly, blood pooling on the marble, and it was only then, as I stood over his body with the maul still crackling in my hand, that I saw there was no weapon. His hand had been reaching for a prayer book, small and worn, its pages marked with countless readings. He had been doing nothing more threatening than attempting to show me his devotions. The priests came quickly, their robes sweeping over the blood-slicked floor. The Arbites came too, and then an official from the administratum, and for hours I stood at attention while they questioned me, examined the body, took statements from witnesses. The pilgrim had been 42 years old, a manufacturum worker with 19 years of loyal service, married with 3 children, his record unmarked by even minor infractions. He had been celebrating the anniversary of his father's death, a minor commemoration that was standard practice among the hive's faithful. I had killed him for praying. The administratum official studied me with eyes like dark stones, his augmetic jaw clicking softly as he processed information from his data slate. He asked me why I had struck. I told him I had perceived a threat. He asked me to describe the threat. I opened my mouth and found I couldn't articulate it. There had been something in the man's posture, some quality I couldn't name but had been absolutely certain indicated danger. The official stared at me for a long moment, then made a notation on his slate. The sound of the stylus on the screen seemed impossibly loud. In the end, I was exonerated. The tribunal, 3 judges whose faces I never saw, their pronouncements delivered via vox speakers hidden behind a grille, declared that I had acted according to my training and authority as a chapel guard. The man's death was regrettable but ultimately the consequence of his own suspicious behavior. The emperor protects those who protect his church, they intoned, and no blame could attach to a guardian acting in good faith to preserve the sanctity of his holy places. I should have felt relief. I should have felt vindicated. Instead, I felt hollow, as if something vital had been scooped out of my chest, leaving only a cold, empty space behind. They gave me a week of mandated rest, which I spent in my bunk, staring at the ceiling and seeing the man's face, over and over, in the moment between my blow landing and his life ending. His expression hadn't been fear or anger, it had been surprise, the innocent bewilderment of someone who couldn't understand what was happening to him. I had taken that face and erased it from existence, and the Imperium had declared this righteous. When I returned to duty, something had fundamentally shifted. The other guards no longer met my eyes at all, even in brief passing. They moved around me like I was contaminated, their body language speaking a rejection that needed no words. The priests, too, seemed different, their blessings perfunctory when they acknowledged me at all, their gazes sliding past me as if I were a servitor rather than a human servant of the emperor. Only the pilgrims remained unchanged, still shuffling through their devotions, still whispering their prayers, still lost in their private communions with the divine. I envied them suddenly, These people who could still approach the Emperor's presence with simple faith, who had not yet learned the cost of that faith, who had not yet been forced to calculate the value of a human life against the abstract concept of security. I watched them, and I wanted to warn them, to tell them to guard their faith carefully, because once it was broken, there was nothing to replace it with but duty, and duty was a cold and terrible thing. The tremors in my hands grew worse. The insomnia became chronic. I began to hear things during my shifts, whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves, voices speaking in languages I didn't recognize, the sound of my own name called out in tones of accusation or mockery. I would spin around, searching for the source, but find only empty air or the blank faces of servitors shuffling past on their endless rounds. Food lost its taste, becoming merely fuel I forced down because regulations required it. My body began to feel strange to me, as if I were operating it from a distance, puppet master to a meat puppet that responded sluggishly to my commands. I noticed I was losing weight, my armor hanging looser on my frame, my face in the dormitory mirror becoming gaunt and hollow-eyed. The chaplain who conducted our weekly prayer sessions asked if I was well. I told him I was fine, that I was merely tired. He studied me with eyes that seemed to see too much, then nodded and said nothing more. Perhaps he saw many of us this way, ground down by the weight of our service. Perhaps he had learned there was no point in intervening. It was around this time that I began to truly notice the servitors. The basilica employed hundreds of them: maintenance units, cleaning units, incense-bearing units that processed through the nave during services, their movements synchronized to the liturgies. They were human-shaped, more or less, but their faces had been replaced with metal plates, bearing only the most basic features: optical sensors where eyes should be, vox grills where mouths had once spoken. Their bodies were augmented with various tools and devices depending on their function: mechanical arms for the maintenance units, scrubbing brushes and chemical dispensers for the cleaning units, ornate thuribles for the incense bearers. They moved with the jerky precision of the mechanically animated, their steps timed to invisible rhythms, their purpose singular and unwavering. I had been taught to regard them as tools, nothing more, the ultimate expression of service to the Imperium, their human components repurposed to serve the greater good long after death would have claimed them naturally. But now, standing watch during the empty hours, I found myself studying them with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Some of them still had flesh visible beneath the augmetics, patches of skin gone grey and waxy with preservation, fingers that ended in mechanical joints but began with human knuckles, sections of scalp where hair still grew in sparse, colorless tufts. These remnants bothered me more than the fully mechanical ones. They suggested that beneath the servitor chassis, some remnant of the original person might persist, some fragment of consciousness trapped in a body that no longer responded to its commands, forced to perform the same tasks endlessly without rest or relief, or even the mercy of sleep. I began to wonder about their origins. Had they volunteered for this transformation, seeing it as the ultimate act of devotion? Had they been criminals, their personalities wiped as punishment, and their bodies repurposed as penance? Or had they simply been expendable, the poor, the desperate, the forgotten, taken by the mechanicus and converted into components as casually as one might recycle scrap metal? The texts we had studied in the Schola Progenium had been vague on such details, focusing instead on the theological justifications and the efficiency gains. Standing in the cold nave at 3 a.m, watching a servitor methodically polish the same section of floor it had polished yesterday and would polish tomorrow, I found the theological justifications less convincing than they had once seemed. I started recognizing individual servitors, despite the fact that they were deliberately designed to be indistinguishable from one another. There was one that carried incense during morning prayers, its gait slightly irregular, favoring its left leg in a way that suggested the mechanical replacement didn't quite match the original. There was one that cleaned the western entrance, and I swore I could see expression in the shadows, where its eyes should have been not emotion exactly, but some quality that hinted at awareness. I gave them names in my head: Foolish names that I would never speak aloud. Limper for the irregular one. Watcher for the one that cleaned the entrance. Others I've forgotten now. I would track their movements during my shifts, note when they were reassigned or when new ones appeared. One day Watcher simply didn't return, replaced by a different model that moved with more efficiency but less of that quality I had imagined I'd seen. I found myself grieving, which was absurd. You don't grieve for tools, for machines, for things that were never truly alive in any meaningful sense. Yet I felt the loss as keenly as if I had lost a companion. The priests began to watch me more closely, or perhaps I was simply more aware of their attention. During services, I would feel eyes on me, and turn to find one of them standing in a shadowed alcove, his cowled face turned in my direction, motionless as a statue. They never approached, never spoke, but their presence felt like a weight pressing down on my shoulders. I wondered if they knew about the thoughts that circled in my head during the long watches, the questions that had begun to eat away at the foundations of my faith like acid on metal. I wondered if they could sense the doubt, the horror, the creeping suspicion that everything I had been taught was wrong, or at least incomplete, or at least more complicated than the simple certainties they had given us. I tried to pray my way out of it, spending my free hours in private devotion, reciting the catechisms until my voice was hoarse and my knees ached from kneeling on cold stone. But the words felt hollow now, empty sounds that echoed in the vaults of my skull without taking root in my heart. I wanted to believe. I desperately wanted to believe. But belief was slipping through my fingers like sand, and I didn't know how to hold on to it. It was during one of my night shifts, when the basilica was empty except for the guards and the servitors, and the priests in their private devotions, that I heard the screaming. It came from below, from somewhere beneath the marble floors, muffled by distance and stone but unmistakable in its agony. It rose and fell in waves, sometimes dying away to nothing before surging back even louder, and it went on for what felt like hours. I stood at my post, my hands clenched around my lazarifal, my body rigid with the effort of pretending I heard nothing. The other guard on duty that night, a woman named Serov, who I had barely spoken to in the 8 months we had worked together, caught my eye across the nave. Her face was pale, her jaw tight, but she shook her head slightly when I took a step toward the sound. "Don't," her expression said. "Don't ask. Don't look. Don't acknowledge." I stayed at my post. The screaming eventually stopped, replaced by a sound like machinery starting up, a deep thrumming that I could feel in my bones. When my shift ended at dawn, I walked past the sealed hatch that led to the crypts beneath, and I could see scorch marks around its edges, fresh and still smoking slightly. The smell of burned meat hung in the air, mixing with the incense. I should have reported what I heard. I should have filed an incident report with the Arbeits, or at least mentioned it to the senior guard. But I did neither. Because I already knew what would happen. I would be told the sounds were none of my concern, that the basilica's inner workings were beyond my clearance level, that my duty was to guard the pilgrims and leave the mysteries to those ordained to understand them. And beneath that official dismissal would be something else, some subtle suggestion that asking such questions marked me as unreliable, potentially corrupted, worthy of closer scrutiny. I had already killed one innocent man. I had already drawn the wrong kind of attention to myself. I couldn't afford to make myself more of a problem, so I stayed silent, and the silence felt like complicity, and the complicity felt like a weight around my neck, pulling me down into waters I couldn't see the bottom of. The seasons cycled again, though the only difference it made inside the hive was the frequency of the power fluctuations and the thickness of the smog visible through the high windows. My second year of service began, then my third. Other guards came and went, some transferred to other postings, some simply disappeared from the roster without explanation. One took his own life in the dormitory, his body discovered during morning wake-up, a note clutched in his hand that no one would tell us the contents of. I remained, not because I wanted to, but because I had nowhere else to go, no other skills to offer, no other identity beyond the one I had built in this place. I was a chapel guard. I protected the basilica. I watched the pilgrims and the servitors and the shadows. The tremors in my hands became constant. The insomnia became my normal state. I lost track of how many days had passed since I had slept more than an hour or two at a stretch. My thoughts moved through my head like someone else's memories, disconnected from me, observed from a distance. The man I had killed appeared in my dreams every night now, his face fixed in that expression of terminal surprise. And behind him came others, the young heretic I had arrested on my 3rd month, the woman with the pamphlets, dozens of others whose faces I had scrutinized with suspicion, whose lives I had potentially disrupted or destroyed with my zealous vigilance. They didn't speak or threaten. They simply stood and looked at me with eyes that asked a question I couldn't answer. Was it worth it? Was their suffering, their fear, their deaths worth whatever security I had provided? I would wake from these dreams, feeling like I was drowning, gasping for air that seemed too thick to breathe, my heart hammering against my ribs like something trying to escape. The chaplain's weekly prayers no longer offered comfort. The Emperor's presence, which I had once felt so keenly in these sacred spaces, seemed to have withdrawn, leaving only cold stone and colder duty. I began to experiment with small acts of rebellion, tiny gestures that no one would notice, but that felt, to me, like reclaiming some fragment of autonomy. I would let pilgrims pass without the usual scrutiny, waving them through without checking their identities or searching their offerings. I would look away when I saw minor infractions, a child running in the nave, someone touching a relic they weren't supposed to touch, small violations of the complex web of rules that govern behavior in the basilica. These acts felt dangerous and exhilarating, even though objectively they changed nothing. The basilica continued, as it always had, eternal and unchanging, and my minor rebellions were like pebbles thrown against a mountain. But they were mine, these small choices, and in a life where every moment was prescribed and every action dictated by duty and doctrine, that meant something. It was during my 4th year that the pilgrim boy approached me. He couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 standard, small and thin in the way that most underhive children were, his clothes patched and repatched until it was impossible to tell what they had originally been. He had been coming to the basilica every day for weeks, always at the same time, always going to the same shrine, a minor alcove dedicated to the Emperor as protector of the innocent. I had noticed him because consistency stood out in the usual chaotic flow of pilgrims, and my training made me suspicious of patterns. But I had watched him carefully and seen nothing alarming, just a child, praying with the serious intensity that children sometimes brought to such things, as if their faith could move mountains through sheer force of will. Today he approached me directly, his small face tilted up to look at mine, and before I could stop him or recite the usual warnings about not disturbing guards on duty, he spoke. "Are you one of the Emperor's angels?" he asked, his voice high and clear. And the question hit me like a physical blow. I stood there, looking down at this child who saw my armor and my weapon and my station, and somehow extracted from it a vision of divine purpose, and I wanted to laugh and weep simultaneously. Angels. We had been taught about the Emperor's angels in the Schola, the Adeptus Astartes, the Space Marines, posthuman warriors who served as the ultimate expression of the Emperor's will. I was so far from that ideal as to make the comparison absurd. I was a broken man with shaking hands and sleepless nights, who had killed an innocent and let the guilty pass, who doubted every certainty I had once held, who stood watch over a building while screaming echoed from its depths, and servitors shuffled past with dead human eyes. An angel. The delusion was so profound I felt something crack inside my chest. "No," I told him, my voice coming out rougher than I intended. "I'm just a guard, just a man." He looked disappointed, his small shoulders sagging, and I felt the need to give him something, some scrap of the faith that he clearly still possessed and I had lost. "But the Emperor protects all who are faithful," I added, the words automatic, drilled into me by years of training. "Keep praying. Keep believing. You're doing everything right." He brightened at that, gave me a gap-toothed smile, and scurried back to his shrine. I watched him go, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years: shame. Not for what I had done, but for what I had become. This child had more genuine faith in his small body than I had in my entire being. He still believed the stories we told, still trusted in the Emperor's protection, still thought the universe made sense, and justice prevailed, and good would ultimately triumph. How long until the hive ground that faith out of him? How long until he learned that protection was conditional, that justice was arbitrary, that good and evil were categories that blurred and shifted depending on who held the power to define them? That night, during my shift, I made a decision. I would investigate the crypts. I would see for myself what happened in those sealed spaces beneath the basilica, would confirm or dispel the suspicions that had been eating at me for years. It was foolish, potentially suicidal, certainly a violation of every rule and regulation I had sworn to uphold. But I needed to know. The not knowing had become its own kind of torture, worse than whatever truth might be hiding below. I waited until the dead hours before dawn, when the basilica was at its emptiest, when even the priests had retreated to their private cells for brief rest. I checked the rotations and confirmed that the nearest other guard was 2 sections away. I moved to the sealed hatch, pulled out the multi-key I had been issued for emergencies, and applied it to the lock. The mechanism resisted, then yielded with a click that seemed impossibly loud in the silence. I lifted the hatch, revealing stairs that descended into darkness, and I could feel air rising from below, warm, wet, carrying smells that made my stomach clench. Incense, yes, but beneath it something organic and wrong, like meat, left too long in heat. I descended. The stairs went down farther than they should have. Farther than the basilica's foundations could possibly extend, down into the hive's substructure, where pipes and cables and machinery formed a dense technological undergrowth. The walls here were not the marble and stone of the basilica proper, but raw rockcrete and exposed metal, and the temperature rose with each step until sweat was running down my back beneath my armor. I could hear machinery now, the same deep thrumming I had heard that night months ago, and beneath it other sounds: metallic clanking, hydraulic hissing, and yes, voices, human voices raised in what might have been prayer or might have been pleading. I reached the bottom of the stairs and found myself in a corridor lit by flickering lumens that cast everything in shades of sickly yellow. Doors lined the corridor, most of them sealed, but one stood slightly ajar, and through it I could see light and movement. I approached as quietly as I could, pressed myself against the wall beside the door, and looked through the gap. What I saw in that room is something I will carry with me until the Emperor finally grants me the mercy of true death. The space was large, a workshop of sorts, filled with medical equipment and mechanical tools, and huge vats of liquid that glowed with a faint greenish luminescence. Tech priests moved through the space with the precise choreography of long practice, their mechadendrites weaving patterns in the air as they worked on bodies strapped to tilted tables. The bodies were human, or had been human, in various stages of conversion to servitor status. Some were still conscious, their eyes wide with terror or resignation or drugged incomprehension as the tech priests peeled back skin and grafted mechanical components into exposed flesh. Some were already more machine than human, their bodies opened up and their organs replaced with cogitators and power cells and pumps. Some were clearly dead, their transformations incomplete or unsuccessful, stacked in one corner like broken equipment awaiting disposal. The smell was overwhelming: blood and chemicals, and the sharp ozone scent of electrical work, all mixed together into something that made me gag. But worse than any of that were the subjects themselves. I recognized them. Not all of them, there were dozens, maybe hundreds, if the other sealed doors held similar operations, but enough. There, on a table in the center of the room, was a manufactorum worker I had seen praying at the basilica for years. A quiet man who had always brought small candles as offerings. His chest was open, his ribs spread like the wings of a mechanical bird, and a tech priest was carefully removing his heart and replacing it with something that pulsed with its own light. There, in one of the vats, Floating in that green liquid was a woman I recognized from the pilgrim crowds, her body already stripped of limbs and fitted with the ports that would accept mechanical replacements. There, stacked with the dead, was the body of Seraph, the guard who had warned me not to investigate the screaming, her face slack in death, her throat bearing the marks of strangulation or perhaps servo-skull cables. They were taking the faithful, the pilgrims who came to pray, and converting them into servitors to maintain the very building they had worshipped in. The efficiency was monstrous. The scale was incomprehensible. The implications made my mind reel. I must have made some sound, a gasp, a whimper, something, because one of the tech priests' heads snapped toward the door with mechanical precision. I ran. I didn't think, didn't plan, just turned and fled back up the stairs with terror lending me speed. I didn't know. I still possessed. Behind me I could hear the whir of servo motors, the mechanical clicking of pursuers whose bodies never tired and whose programming would not let them stop until they had eliminated the security breach I represented. I burst through the hatch into the basilica proper, slammed it shut behind me, and kept running, my boots slipping on marble floors that suddenly felt like the surface of a trap. Where could I go? Who could I tell? The priests had to know the basilica was their domain. These operations could not happen without their knowledge or consent. The Arbites? They served the same Imperium that allowed this, that required this, that ran on the fuel of human suffering converted to mechanical efficiency. The other guards? Most of them probably didn't know. And if I told them, I would just be marking them for the same fate I now faced. I ran through the nave, past the towering statues of the Emperor that suddenly looked less like symbols of protection and more like monuments to indifferent power. I ran past the shrines where pilgrims still prayed in the early morning light, innocent in their devotion, unaware that their faith was being used to lure them to conversion tables. I ran toward the main entrance, thinking only that I needed to get out, get away, survive long enough to decide what to do with what I knew. But the doors, those great bronze doors that I had guarded for 4 years, they wouldn't open. I pulled at them with all my strength, but they were sealed, locked from the inside by mechanisms I had no access to. I was trapped. The basilica that had been my world, my purpose, my identity, had become my prison. I turned to find the tech priests emerging from the shadows, 3 of them, their robes pristine red against the grey stone, their movements synchronized and inevitable. Behind them came the priests of the Ministorum, their black robes flowing like oil, their faces finally visible beneath their cowls, cold, ascetic, certain in their righteousness. And behind them, other guards, my fellows, their faces carefully blank, but their weapons trained on me. The lead priest spoke, his voice the same one that had delivered sermons about duty and sacrifice, and he told me what I had already begun to understand. The basilica needed servitors to function. The mechanicus needed subjects for their sacred work. The faithful provided both, their bodies given in service even if their minds had not consciously consented. This was the reality beneath the prayer and the incense and the magnificent architecture. This was the transaction at the heart of faith. The flock maintained the church, and in the end, the flock became the church, their very bodies converted into its operating systems. It was efficient. It was practical. It was, he assured me, the Emperor's will. For did not all things ultimately serve his design? I listened to him speak, and I felt the last fragments of my faith crumble into dust. Not because I stopped believing in the Emperor. I couldn't stop believing in him any more than I could stop believing in gravity or time or death. But I stopped believing in the Imperium that claimed to serve him, stopped believing in the institutions that had shaped my entire life, stopped believing that there was any nobility or purpose in the service I had rendered. The Emperor was real, distant, and golden, and terrible. But these men who claimed to act in his name were just men, making choices that served their own needs and justifying them with theological language that made monstrosity sound like virtue. The boy had asked if I was an angel. I wasn't an angel. I was kindling for a fire that would never stop burning, fuel for a machine that would never stop grinding, meat for tables that would never run empty. They gave me a choice. In the end, though it was no choice at all, I could submit to conversion willingly, allowing the tech priests to work on me with a sedative that would make the process bearable, and in exchange, they would ensure my servitor form served in the basilica rather than being sold to some manufactorum or sent to a Departamento Munitorum logistics unit. I would remain here, in the only place I had ever belonged, performing the duties I had performed in life. Or I could resist, and they would kill me here and now, and my body would be converted anyway but without the care or the local posting. The lead priest assured me this was mercy. The tech priests waited patiently, their mechanical components ticking softly in the silence. The other guards stood watch, their faces carefully empty, and I wondered if they had known all along or if they, like me, had just learned to stop asking questions. I thought about running. I thought about fighting. I thought about screaming, about causing enough commotion that the pilgrims would see, though what good that would do I couldn't imagine. In the end, I simply nodded. What else was there? I had been trapped long before I descended into those crypts, trapped by my training, my indoctrination, my identity as a soldier in an army that fought for something I could no longer define. The only real choice I had was whether to die with dignity or without it. And even that was a lie, because dignity had been stripped from me years ago, piece by piece, until all that remained was a hollow shell, performing motions that meant nothing. I felt the sedative hit my system, fast-acting and efficient, and I could feel my body growing heavy, my thoughts scattering like birds startled into flight. The last thing I remember before darkness took me was the face of that pilgrim boy, smiling up at me with absolute faith, asking if I was an angel. I wanted to tell him something, some final truth or warning, but my lips wouldn't move, and my voice had already fled. I woke into a different kind of darkness, one without dreams or rest or release. My body was no longer mine. I could feel it, could sense the places where flesh had given way to metal, where nerves had been spliced into wires, where my autonomy had been stripped away and replaced with programming that moved my limbs according to patterns I didn't choose. I couldn't speak. I couldn't scream. I could only observe, a consciousness trapped behind eyes that no longer saw the way human eyes saw, processing light in mechanical increments, recording but not interpreting, watching but not understanding. They put me on cleaning duty, gave me brushes and solvents, set me to maintaining the marble floors I had once walked as a guard. I move through the basilica now in endless loops, the same paths every day, my servitor body performing tasks with the efficiency that flesh could never achieve. I see the pilgrims still coming, still praying, still faithful, and I cannot warn them. I see the guards standing watch, their faces already showing the signs of the strain that will break them eventually, and I cannot tell them what awaits. I see the priests moving through their rituals, their voices rising in prayers that ring hollow in my mechanically enhanced hearing, and I cannot scream the truth that I have learned, that we are all fuel, all components, all resources, to be converted and consumed by a machine that calls itself holy. Sometimes the boy still comes, older now but still faithful, still bringing his small offerings to his small shrine. He doesn't recognize me, of course. How could he? The face he saw, the guard he spoke to, that person is gone, replaced by a metal plate bearing optical sensors that record his prayers with mechanical dispassion. He kneels and he prays, his lips moving in words I can no longer hear properly but can still remember, and I want to reach out to him, want to grab him with these mechanical hands and shake him and tell him to run, to flee, to never come back, to find some other way to keep his faith alive. But I can't move except as programmed. I can't speak except in the binary cant of the Mechanicus. I can't do anything but watch as he grows, year by year, his child's faith, slowly maturing into an adult's devotion, watching as he edges closer to that moment when the basilica will claim him as it claimed me. This is the brutal life of a chapel guard. Or rather, this is what comes after that life ends. I protected the basilica for 4 years, and now I will maintain it for however long my components function before they wear out, and I am replaced by the next pilgrim, the next faithful servant, the next willing sacrifice to the eternal appetite of the machine. The Emperor protects, we were taught. The Emperor provides, the priests intoned. But I have learned the truth that hides beneath these comfortable phrases the Emperor consumes, and we are all invited to his table, though none of us understand until too late that we are not guests at the feast, but the feast itself. I was a faithful servant. I did my duty. I believed with all my heart. And in exchange for that faith and that service and that belief, I received this existence without end, consciousness without agency, horror without release. If there is mercy in the universe, I haven't found it. If there is purpose in suffering, I cannot see it. There is only the endless cycle of conversion. Prayer converted to mechanical routine, flesh converted to machine, hope converted to despair, and despair converted into the very stones and circuits that keep the basilica functioning for the next generation of faithful, who will walk through its doors and kneel before its altars and eventually feed its hunger. The other servitors shuffle past me in the corridors, and sometimes I think I recognize them, Serov. Yes, but others too, guards and pilgrims and even priests, who must have asked one question too many or seen one thing too much. We move in our prescribed patterns, perfect in our efficiency, terrible in our silence. We are the truth of the Imperium made manifest, the human reduced to component, the individual crushed beneath the weight of collective purpose, the sacred revealed as merely systematic. The basilica stands eternal, its buttresses rising toward a smog-choked sky, its bells ringing out the hours, its candles burning for prayers that will never be answered except with this conversion, consumption, the final communion where flesh is made machine and the Emperor's hunger is fed one soul at a time. I was a chapel guard. I thought I understood duty. I thought I understood sacrifice. I understand now, but understanding changes nothing. The knowledge is mine, trapped in this mechanical prison, and it will die with me when my components finally fail. As all knowledge dies, as all truth is consumed by the grinding wheels of necessity and expedience, and the lies we tell ourselves to make bearable the unbearable, the basilica endures. The faithful come, the conversions continue, and I clean the floors where I once stood watch, my brush moving in precise mechanical arcs, erasing the footprints of the living who walk toward the fate I have already met, and there is nothing I can do to stop it. This is the brutal life of a chapel guard, and there is no escape from this life, only the transformation into something that remembers life the way a machine remembers a ghost, as data, as pattern, as nothing that matters. The Emperor protects, the Emperor provides, the Emperor consumes, and I, who once believed these words meant salvation, now know they mean only this, an eternity of service, with no possibility of rest, no hope of redemption, no mercy, but the final mechanical failure that will claim even this, my last and only possession, the consciousness that records my own dissolution, and can do nothing but bear witness to the horror. This is what I learned in the Basilica of Eternal Vigil. This is what I became. This is the truth beneath the prayer and the incense and the magnificent lies. Remember this, if you can. Remember, though remembering changes nothing. The basilica stands, the faithful come, and the machine grinds on, eternal and hungry, converting flesh to purpose, converting life to function, converting everything holy into the simple mechanics of survival. I was a chapel guard. I am a servitor now. And the difference between those two things is smaller than I ever imagined possible.